This is Limited Run, the complete run. While limited run games landed more momentous partnerships during its early years, you'd be hard-pressed to name one more perfectly suited to the company than WayForward's Shantae games, Risky's Revenge and The Pirate's Curse. The Shantae series is hardly the world's biggest gaming property, but as with limited run, the modest scale of the franchise belies the enthusiasm of its fanbase. And not unlike limited run's earliest Mighty Rabbit Studios releases, Risky's Revenge in particular traveled a long and bumpy road before it appeared as a physical release. The Shantae franchise made its debut back on Game Boy Color in 2002, well after that platform had been swept into irrelevance by the Game Boy Advance. Those few players who stuck with the system that long and bothered to pick up one of the few late GBC releases not to be tied to some sort of children's media property were rewarded for their perspicacity, though. Shantae turned out to be a wonderful, if sometimes overly difficult, little platformer in the Wonder Boy vein, one that's become quite valuable now. In many ways, it could be seen as the last great 8-bit game, but its historic value and innate quality didn't quite translate into sales, and Shantae quickly faded into obscurity. Developer WayForward didn't give up on their creation though, continuing to pitch and prototype a sequel through the Game Boy Advance era and into the Nintendo DS days. Unfortunately, risk-averse publishers consistently declined to commit to a game whose predecessor had been doomed to obscurity by a quirk of timing, and WayForward would ultimately have to go it alone. That opportunity finally arose in 2010 when Nintendo launched an upgraded variant of the DS handheld called the DSi, a platform whose primary improvement was the inclusion of a digital download service for unique software, called DSiWare. The idea behind DSiWare was not to sell retail releases in digital-only form. That option wouldn't arrive until the Nintendo 3DS launched the following year. Instead, DSiWare titles were meant to be smaller releases, including titles by indie devs and more daring works that might have posed a financial risk when the costs of physical distribution were factored in. Or, in a few cases, a relatively low-risk format for high-quality titles that couldn't find backing from a publisher, such as Shantae. And so, Risky's Revenge, by far the most ambitious and polished title released for DSiWare. Shantae's second adventure had followed on from her first, covering many of the same familiar beats as the first game and revisiting areas from the GBC release as an excuse to polish them up with beautiful bitmap graphics that looked as good and animated as smoothly as the DS's top-tier 2D masterpieces. WayForward has always been known for its game's graphical prowess, and Shantae's creators, husband and wife team Matt and Aaron Bozon, trained to be animators. That training and enthusiasm comes into full focus in Risky's Revenge, a game that realizes the potential the original Shantae hinted at. It's not just that Risky's Revenge looks better than Shantae on GBC did, it plays better too. WayForward spent years iterating and refining the game and reviewing feedback from fans of the original, and in doing so they managed to incorporate all the refinements you expect in a sequel, and then some. Although Risky's Revenge does scale back in some senses from the world of the original, with a less sprawling overworld to manage, the trade-off is a tighter, more focused adventure overall. It's also less toilsome to play. Risky's Revenge drops the day-night cycle that caused enemies to double in strength and durability once the sun went down. Combined with the fact that enemy hit point values are reduced considerably overall, Risky's Revenge maintains a faster, less punishing pace than the Game Boy game, with monsters that still pose a threat, but don't force players to constantly stop and strike them repeatedly in order to defeat them. Another significant change comes in Shantae's special power scheme. As the half-genie protector of Scuttletown, Shantae has some limited command over magic, specifically shape-shifting magic. In the original game, players could transform into different creatures by activating a special dance mode and using specific button input sequences, a bit like the songs in The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time. While this made for a charming and thematic mechanic, it also further slowed the game's pace and introduced the possibility of flubbing an input in the heat of battle. Risky's Revenge simplifies this process considerably. By pressing the right shoulder trigger, you activate Shantae's dance mode, causing her to cycle through different moves. Depending on which part of her dance cycle you release the button at, she'll change into one of 3 different alternate forms: a monkey, an elephant, or a mermaid, each with different powers. Not only does this help reduce the friction of gameplay considerably from the previous game, it also makes Shantae's transformations more viable as combat maneuvers during boss encounters and allows for many seamless puzzles. Fundamentally, Shantae moves and controls much the same as in the first game. In fact, her animations are more or less carried over from the Game Boy Color and upgraded to match the more detailed look of this world. She runs, jumps, crawls, and attacks by whipping bad guys with her ponytail. As with every other aspect of the game, her jumps are a little smoother this time around, and her hair whip attacks have a slightly more generous hitbox. You can also upgrade the speed of her hair whip to allow you to attack faster, as well as purchase both consumable combat items and permanent magic skills alike. Many of the best upgrades require not only cash to purchase, but also a hidden trade item called Magic Jam, which both introduces a collectathon element to the game, as well as giving it inherent value beyond completism. Another unique feature added here comes in the way players navigate the world. Rather than consisting of a single, massive 2D plane to be explored, Risky's Revenge presents its environments as layers, allowing Shantae to leap into the foreground or background at specially designated points. The WayForward team borrowed this mechanic from their DS adaptation of Where the Wild Things Are, and while it doesn't radically change the game, it goes a long way toward maintaining a brisk pace. Backtracking and exploration take less time and involve less wandering through confusing environments, because the world has been compacted into a denser layout. It's a neat touch for everyone who has ever looked at the elaborate backgrounds in 2D games like this and wondered, how come I can't go back there? Now you can. The finale of Risky's Revenge introduces a significant shift in the series' status quo that carries over into its sequel. The entire adventure turns out to be a scheme engineered by the wicked pirate queen Risky Boots in revenge for her defeat in the first game, while increasing her own powers. Risky opens the game by launching an attack on Scuttletown, which causes the mayor to lose confidence in Shantae and fire her, sending Shantae on a quest to recover a trio of magic seals that she hopes will thwart Risky's schemes and defeat her once and for all. But surprise, this is all a gambit by Risky to gather up the magic seals in order to unlock a forbidden power, which ends up manifesting as an evil version of Shantae. Though Shantae triumphs over her dark mirror image, she ultimately loses access to her genie powers. And this leads us to the next Shantae adventure, initially released for 3DS, but published on disc for PlayStation 4 through Limited Run the same day as Risky's Revenge. Shantae and the Pirate's Curse carries forward the direct through line of game design and mechanics that began in Shantae for GBC and continued in Risky's Revenge. At the same time, this is no mere reprise of what had come before. Not only does it look markedly different, with detailed painterly backgrounds, but Shantae makes use of completely new play mechanics in order to navigate a world whose structure breaks from the contiguous design of the first two games. Lacking her genie magic, Shantae can no longer transform or cast spells in the Pirate's Curse. Instead, she's forced to rely on the skills she gains by acquiring Risky's lost pirate relics. Her hat, her sword, her gun, and yes, her boots. If Shantae's previous adventures played like the Wonder Boy series, relying on form changing and spellcasting for advancement, the Pirate's Curse takes a page from the Metroid series by emphasizing the use of tools that prove essential for both navigation and combat. Risky's hat allows Shantae to turn her leaps into long glides to reach new areas, while her saber confers the ability to shatter the ground and bounce off enemies with downward thrusts. The gun fires projectiles that damage enemies, but it can also trigger switches that open doors. This change to Shantae's skill set makes the Pirate's Curse a much faster-paced game than Risky's Revenge, which in turn was much faster than the original Shantae, further sanding away the friction between action and mechanics. Now, rather than activating a dance mode in order to access Shantae's powers, you activate them with the press of a button. Holding the shoulder button will cause her to deploy her hat sail. Pressing down while in mid-air will cause her to brandish her blade. Pressing the circle button will fire her gun, and so forth. The enemies you encounter along the way reflect these changes too. They tend to be less of the damage sponges you faced in the previous games, especially the bosses, but they hit a lot harder now. Overall, the Pirate's Curse is a speedier game that emphasizes evasion, precision platforming, and efficiency over hammering the attack button, to the point that Shantae now has a backstep button to allow her to quickly dodge out of the way of bad guys. The new world structure helps speed things along too. There's no longer a connective overworld to navigate. Instead, you select from more than half a dozen different standalone areas, and Risky drops you off at the entrance to each area on her boat. Like Shantae, Risky has lost many of her powers here, so she eats humble pie and becomes Shantae's partner for this journey. In this sense, the Pirate's Curse seems to draw its greatest design inspiration from Metroid Fusion or Castlevania Portrait of Ruin. Each of the standalone areas here has a non-linear, puzzle-like design, and you gain access to the bulk of each region in the form of a dungeon that has to be uncovered by gaining new powers or completing some sort of task first. Although the loss of the interconnected world does change the overall feel of the game, the upshot is that this is by far the largest Shantae adventure to date. There's plenty of reason to revisit completed areas, both to hunt for collectibles and to perform mission-critical tasks that allow you to advance in other areas. But most of all, the modular world design allows each island you explore to feature its own vibe, as well as its own distinct, self-contained narrative and challenges. These range from an auto-run dash sequence to carry Shantae's zombie frenemy Roddy-Tops to safety through a haunted graveyard, to sneaking through a desert palace in a slinky costume after being mistaken for a princess. The humor here can be ribald, to say the least. It's big on gross-out jokes, scantily clad ladies, and sometimes the intersection between the two. But at the same time, The Pirate's Curse offers some of the most satisfying Metroidvania-style gameplay to be found on any platform. It feels like the point at which the series truly came into its own, a maturing of sorts despite all the gleeful immaturity on display. Limited Run released both Risky's Revenge and The Pirate's Curse for PS4 in October of 2016. The Pirate's Curse also appeared on Switch through Limited Run a little more than 2 years later, in December 2018. As both a standard and a limited edition that included a soundtrack CD, a non-working replica of the Pirate's Curse Game Boy Color cartridge complete in box, and a poster and art cards all in an oversized box. This would begin a long and fruitful relationship between WayForward and Limited Run, which continues to this day with recent releases such as Shantae and the Seven Sirens, the 5th chapter in the series. It took her a little while to find traction, but Shantae has become a fixture, and it's not hard to see why, with these two excellent Metroidvania platformers under her belt. Not that she actually wears a belt, of course.